before they fell in love. Their grandfathers were best friends. Then history tore their world apart. For nearly 80 years, two families carried the same unanswered questions, never knowing the people they missed were still alive. Now, in a city thousands of miles from where it all began, an Indian engineer, a Pakistani doctor, meet by chance while helping strangers after a devastating flood. Neither knows that every conversation, every shared cup of coffee, every heartbeat, is quietly leading them toward a promise made long before they were born. Can love heal what history broke? Can kindness succeed where politics failed? This is not just a love story. It is a story about friendship, family, forgiveness, and the invisible threads that connect generations. Welcome to Gold Thread Studios. Beneath the Same Sky. Season 1, Episode 1. The First Hello. There are cities where people spend their entire lives surrounded by strangers. Not because they wish to be alone, but because everyone is moving, always moving, toward another train, another deadline, another tomorrow. In cities like these, entire lives brush against one another every single day without ever truly meeting. Yet every so often, the universe pauses. Not for history. Not for politics. Not for nations. Simply for two people. Chicago had awakened beneath heavy gray clouds. Rain had fallen throughout the night. The Chicago River rolled darker than usual, carrying branches, leaves, forgotten umbrellas, and reflections of glass towers that shimmered like fractured mirrors. Morning commuters hurried beneath umbrellas. Taxi horns echoed between skyscrapers. Steam drifted upward from subway grates. Coffee shops overflowed with people seeking warmth before another long workday. The city looked ordinary. No one noticed that before sunset, two families, separated by nearly 8 decades of history, would unknowingly begin walking toward one another. Nearly 8,000 miles away, the village where Aarav Mehta's grandfather was born still greeted each sunrise with temple bells. The air smelled of sandalwood. Marigolds decorated ancient stone steps. Generations had prayed beneath the same carved ceiling. Stories older than memory floated through those halls. Stories about sacrifice, honor, family. Stories passed from fathers to sons, some filled with hope, others with wounds that had never completely healed. Across another border, another morning arrived beneath the call to prayer. In the city where Aaliyah Khan's grandmother first opened her eyes, mosques welcomed worshippers before dawn. The scent of cardamom tea drifted through quiet neighborhoods. Children chased pigeons across worn courtyards. Old men argued about cricket beneath banyan trees. Life moved forward, just as it always had. Yet hidden inside nearly every family, there remained one story. A story about leaving, about trains, about fear. About neighbors who became strangers almost overnight. Stories that grandparents rarely finished. Stories grandchildren rarely understood. America had given both families new beginnings. New passports. New careers. New homes. But history has an extraordinary way of fitting inside luggage, even when no one realizes they packed it. On the north side of Chicago, Aarav adjusted the sleeves of his Navy volunteer jacket before stepping out of his car. Floodwaters had damaged dozens of homes after relentless storms. Volunteers had gathered before sunrise. Teachers, college students, construction workers, doctors. engineers, neighbors, people who believed strangers were worth helping. He signed his name at the registration table, accepted a pair of work gloves, picked up bottled water, and quietly joined the growing crowd. He had no idea that somewhere among those volunteers, destiny had already arrived. To be continued. Chapter 2. The Woman in the Blue Raincoat. Rain has a peculiar talent. It makes strangers look alike. Everyone walks a little faster. Everyone bows their head. Everyone searches for shelter beneath the same gray sky. For a few brief moments, status disappears. Professions disappear. Borders disappear. Only people remain. The volunteer center occupied what had once been an elementary school gymnasium. Its polished hardwood floor was now covered with folding tables, bottled water, medical supplies, blankets, generators, and stacks of donated clothing. Children played quietly in one corner while exhausted parents filled out paperwork. The scent of wet denim, fresh coffee, cardboard boxes, and disinfectant drifted through the building. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, hope was being unpacked one cardboard box at a time. Aarav had always preferred work that required his hands. There was honesty in lifting, honesty in repairing, honesty in helping someone who would never know your name. Without being asked, he carried cases of drinking water toward one of the loading trucks. Another volunteer caught the opposite side. "Thanks," a woman's voice said. Warm. Calm. Steady. The kind of voice that could lower another person's heartbeat. He glanced up. She wore a blue raincoat with the hood pushed back. Dark curls escaped around her face despite the weather. Her sleeves were already soaked from unloading supplies. A strand of hair clung to her cheek. She brushed it away without noticing. Her smile wasn't dramatic. It wasn't practiced. It simply appeared, like sunlight finding its way through heavy clouds. "Heavy?" she asked. "A little." "I've got it." Together they lifted the boxes into the truck. Neither realized they had matched each other's pace almost instantly. No awkward adjustments. No struggle. Just two strangers moving as though they had rehearsed the moment. Hours passed. The volunteers split into neighborhood teams. Some cleared fallen trees. Others distributed food. Medical professionals established temporary clinics. Children received blankets and coloring books. No one cared where anyone came from. Only what needed to be done next. Aaliyah Khan knelt beside an elderly woman whose blood pressure had dropped after standing in line too long. "You're dehydrated," she said gently. "We're going to fix that." The old woman squeezed her hand. "You remind me of my granddaughter." Aaliyah smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should." Nearby, a little boy clutched a stuffed dinosaur with one missing eye. He stared at Aarav, who was assembling folding cots with remarkable speed. "You build things." "I try." "My dinosaur's broken." Aarav accepted the toy with complete seriousness. He searched through his tool bag. A tiny needle. Strong thread. A small patch of green fabric. 5 careful minutes later, the dinosaur looked ready for another lifetime of adventures. The boy gasped. "You fixed him." "No," Aarav said softly. "I just reminded him who he already was." Across the room, Aaliyah looked up. For the first time that day, she truly noticed him. Not because he was handsome, though he was. Not because he stood taller than most people, though he did. She noticed him because of the way he spoke to children. patiently, without pretending, without talking down to them, as though every child deserved the same respect as every adult. Some qualities could not be taught, only revealed. Their eyes met. Just for a second. Neither looked away immediately. Neither smiled too quickly. There was only quiet recognition, the kind that asks no questions, yet somehow begins answering them. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, something invisible had just begun. Neither of them knew it. But history had taken its very first step toward becoming something else. Chapter 3. Names carry echoes. There are moments so ordinary that no one notices history quietly changing direction. No music announces them. No light breaks through the clouds. No voice whispers that life will never be the same. Most begin with something astonishingly simple. A shared smile. A borrowed pen. A cup of coffee. Or a conversation that almost never happened. By late afternoon, the rain had surrendered to a silver mist. The emergency shelter had settled into a rhythm. Families found places to rest. Children laughed again. Volunteers leaned against walls, stretching tired backs and aching shoulders. Someone arrived carrying trays of hot chai, coffee, and sandwiches donated by local restaurants. For the first time all day, people stopped working, long enough to breathe. Aarav stood near the gymnasium doors, cradling a paper cup of coffee between chilled hands. He watched volunteers drift through the room like pieces of a carefully choreographed dance. No one commanded them. Need simply found the people willing to answer it. You look like you're trying to solve the world's problems. The familiar voice made him turn. The woman in the blue raincoat. Except now the raincoat hung over one arm, revealing navy medical scrubs beneath a volunteer vest. She held 2 steaming cups. I brought backup. He accepted one with a grateful smile. Thank you. You've earned it. So have you. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. Like 2 hikers pausing to admire the same mountain. I don't think we've officially met, she said. She extended her hand. I'm Aaliyah. He shook it gently. Aarav. The names lingered in the air. Tiny sounds. Just a few syllables each. Yet each carried centuries of culture. Family. Memory. Neither recognized the weight immediately. They simply sounded beautiful. What do you normally do? She asked. I'm a software architect. She laughed softly. I guess carpenter. I hear that a lot. And you? I'm an emergency physician. His eyebrows lifted. So that's why everyone keeps asking where Dr. Khan is. She smiled. Guilty. You've probably saved half this building today. I've mostly handed out band-aids and reminded people to drink water. Sometimes that's enough. The conversation wandered easily. Favorite books. Chicago Winters. The best place to find good coffee. Whether deep dish pizza was actually pizza. They disagreed. Naturally. She insisted it was comfort food. He argued it was a casserole pretending to be pizza. Their laughter echoed across the gymnasium. Several volunteers glanced over, smiling without knowing why. Joy has a way of introducing itself to everyone nearby. Near the registration desk, an elderly volunteer searched through a clipboard. We're updating emergency contact information, she called. If you haven't signed in completely, please come by. One by one, volunteers approached. Aaliyah stepped forward first. She wrote carefully. Dr. Aaliyah Khan. Aarav arrived moments later. He picked up the same pen. Aarav Mehta. The elderly volunteer looked between the forms. Oh. She smiled warmly. Different backgrounds. Wonderful. Neither thought much of the comment. They simply returned the clipboard and walked away together. But across the room, another volunteer happened to glance at the names. His smile faded almost imperceptibly. Not from anger. From recognition. He knew those surnames. He knew the histories they often carried. He said nothing. Yet a single thought crossed his mind. That could become complicated. Outside, the clouds finally began to part. A ribbon of golden evening sunlight slipped between Chicago's towers. It painted the wet streets in bronze, as if the city itself were stitching light across the scars left by the storm. Neither Aarav nor Aaliyah noticed. They were too busy discovering that conversation, like rivers, sometimes finds a path no map could predict. And somewhere beyond the skyline, the first quiet echoes of the past had begun to awaken. Chapter 4. The Little Girl Who Saw Tomorrow. Children possess a curious gift. They notice truths that adults spend years trying to ignore. Not because children understand the world better, but because they have not yet learned where they are supposed to look. They do not measure people by surnames. They do not recognize old borders hidden inside conversations. They do not inherit prejudice. Someone has to teach it to them. The rain had finally stopped. Outside the shelter, volunteers began unloading the last truck of donated supplies. The evening air carried the scent of wet pavement, fresh earth, and the faint sweetness of blooming linden trees. Chicago was beginning to breathe again. So were its people. Aarav and Aaliyah worked side by side, organizing food boxes for families returning to damaged homes. Neither noticed how naturally they had fallen into a rhythm. He lifted. She sorted. He stacked. She checked names. Every now and then they exchanged a glance. Not because words were needed, but because some partnerships begin long before either person realizes one has formed. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, wandered toward them clutching a faded stuffed rabbit. Her boots were 2 sizes too big. Her pigtails had long surrendered to the day's rain. She studied them with the solemn concentration only children can manage. Then she asked, with complete sincerity, "Are you two married?" Silence. Aarav blinked. Aaliyah nearly laughed into the clipboard she was holding. "No," Aarav replied gently. "We just met." The little girl frowned. She looked from one face to the other, then shook her head. "I don't think that's true." Aaliyah knelt so they were eye level. "What makes you say that?" The child shrugged. "You smile with your eyes when you look at each other." Neither adult had an answer. Children sometimes say things that land with the weight of prophecy. The girl's mother hurried over, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry." She asks everyone questions. "It's all right," Aaliyah said warmly. The woman smiled apologetically before leading her daughter away. As they disappeared into the shelter, the little girl turned back one last time. She waved, then called out, "I hope you find each other again." Neither Aarav nor Aaliyah spoke for several moments. Finally, he chuckled. Children have remarkable imaginations. They do. Another pause. "Do I really smile with my eyes?" She looked at him for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Yes." "And you?" "I suppose you'll have to ask someone else." He smiled. "I don't think I need to." The sun slipped beneath the clouds just enough to flood the western skyline with molten gold. Every puddle became a mirror. Every glass building caught fire with reflected light. For one impossible moment, the entire city seemed woven together by strands of gold. as though invisible threads stretched from one life to another. Across streets, across neighborhoods, across histories, across borders. Neither of them noticed the elderly volunteer watching from the shelter doorway. She had lived long enough to recognize the beginning of stories. Not every story, just the important ones. She whispered quietly to herself. The hardest journeys always begin with the gentlest meetings. Then she smiled. Not because she knew how their story would end, but because she knew that every great love story begins exactly this way, with two people who still believe they are simply helping strangers, and have no idea they have already started changing each other's world. Chapter 5. The Names Behind the Names. There is a question people often ask without realizing its weight. Where are you from? Sometimes they mean a city, sometimes a country. Sometimes they're asking something much older, something hidden beneath accents, traditions, and surnames. The answer is rarely as simple as geography. Sometimes it is an entire family history compressed into a single sentence. The last delivery truck pulled away just as dusk settled over Chicago. The shelter had grown quieter. Families who still had homes returned to them. Others prepared to spend another night on folding cots. The volunteers began cleaning, sweeping floors, folding tables, and stacking empty boxes. Work has a curious way of stripping away formality. By the end of a long day, titles no longer mattered. Doctors swept floors beside electricians. Engineers collected trash with high school students. Everyone became simply human. Aarav pushed a broom across the gymnasium floor. Aaliyah appeared beside him carrying a box of unopened bottled water. You know, she said, for a software architect, you're surprisingly good with a toolbox. He laughed. My grandfather would be offended if I weren't. He taught you. He taught me almost everything worth knowing. She smiled. My grandmother would say the same. There was a softness in her voice when she spoke of family. The kind reserved for people who had shaped your soul. They carried the final box into a storage room together. The silence between them had changed. It no longer belonged to strangers. It belonged to two people becoming comfortable with each other's presence. I've been meaning to ask, Aaliyah said. Your family, are they from India? Aarav nodded. Gujarat. My parents immigrated before I was born. And yours? She rested the box on a shelf before answering. Lahore. My parents came here in the early 90s. For the briefest instant, neither spoke. The words settled gently between them. India. Pakistan. Two countries. Two histories. Two stories taught differently on opposite sides of a border. Neither of them reacted. Not because they were unaware, but because, in that moment, the names meant less than the person standing in front of them. My grandmother still makes enough food for 20 people, Aarav said with a grin. Aaliyah laughed. My grandmother would insist yours hadn't eaten enough. They both laughed harder. It sounds like they'd get along. They'd probably argue over whose recipe is authentic. And secretly exchange cooking tips. Exactly. For a moment, history lost another inch of ground. Outside the storage room, two older volunteers walked past. One glanced inside. He noticed the conversation, the smiles, the easy laughter. He leaned toward his companion. They seemed to have hit it off. His friend nodded. They're young. They don't know how complicated life can become. The first man looked back once more. Maybe. Or maybe they know something we've forgotten. They continued walking. Neither realized how true those words would become. When Aarav and Aaliyah stepped back into the gymnasium, the lights had dimmed for the evening. Only a handful of volunteers remained. Someone switched on a small radio near the reception desk. Soft instrumental music floated through the nearly empty shelter. Outside, the city lights reflected across rain-soaked streets like thousands of tiny stars that had fallen to earth. Chicago no longer felt enormous. It felt intimate. As though, for one evening, the city had folded itself into a single shared moment. A moment between two people whose ancestors had once been separated by borders, yet who now stood together beneath the same American sky. Neither knew what tomorrow would bring. Neither could imagine the conversations waiting at family dinner tables, the questions, the assumptions, the fears inherited from another generation. Tonight, there was only kindness, only curiosity, only the quiet beginning of something that neither politics nor history had planned. And sometimes, that is exactly how history begins to change. Chapter 6, The Long Way Home. Every city has two faces. The one everyone sees, and the one revealed only after rain. Streetlights shimmered across wet asphalt. The elevated trains carved ribbons of light through the evening. The Chicago River reflected skyscrapers in wavering fragments, as though the city were remembering itself one ripple at a time. Volunteers began saying their goodbyes. Names were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Promises were made to return in the morning. One by one, the shelter grew quieter. Aarav slipped on his jacket and stepped outside. The air had cooled enough that his breath lingered for a moment before dissolving into the night. He had taken only a few steps toward the parking lot when he heard footsteps behind him. Aarav. He turned. Aaliyah stood beneath the shelter's awning, holding her keys. I just realized. We never exchanged numbers. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. She laughed. So you were waiting for me to be brave? I was trying not to assume. Good answer. They exchanged phones. Each typed carefully. Neither noticed how strangely significant such a simple act could feel. A name. A number. A quiet invitation into tomorrow. Be honest, she asked. Were you always this calm? He pretended to think about it. My mother would probably say no. And your grandmother? She'd tell you I talked too much until I was 12. Aaliyah laughed. My grandmother says I still talk too much. I find that difficult to believe. You've known me one day. I've learned quickly. She shook her head, smiling. You really are dangerous. Dangerous. You make people feel comfortable. He blinked. I've never been accused of that before. Maybe you should be. The parking lot slowly emptied. Rainwater glistened beneath the streetlights. Neither seemed eager to leave. Not because they had something extraordinary left to say, but because ordinary conversations had become unexpectedly precious. Across the street, an older man sat inside a small tea shop, watching the world through rain-speckled windows. He had spent decades observing people, long enough to recognize hesitation, long enough to recognize beginnings. He watched the two young volunteers talking beside their cars, smiling, laughing, stretching a goodbye that neither wanted to end. He smiled into his cup of chai. Young hearts, he murmured. They always believe time is generous. Finally, Aaliyah opened her car door. I should go. So should I. Neither moved. She looked at him. Same time tomorrow? If you're volunteering, I'll be here. Then so will I. She nodded. Good night, Aarav. Good night, Aaliyah. She drove away slowly. He stood watching until her taillights disappeared into the flowing river of Chicago traffic. Only then did he climb into his own car. The drive home should have taken 25 minutes. Instead, he missed his exit. Twice. His thoughts wandered back to the woman in the blue raincoat. To the little girl who had mistaken them for a married couple. To shared laughter over deep dish pizza. To the ease of conversation that felt strangely familiar. He caught himself smiling at a red light, then laughed at himself. You've known her for one day. His own reflection in the windshield seemed unconvinced. Across the city, Aaliyah made exactly the same mistake. She passed her apartment building before realizing she had driven an extra 3 blocks. She sighed, turned around, then laughed quietly. This is ridiculous. She had worked 16-hour hospital shifts without losing focus. Yet one conversation had left her driving on autopilot. Neither of them noticed another truth. When they arrived home, each would be asked the same simple question. How was your day? Neither answer would mention the person who had quietly become the most memorable part of it. Not yet. Some stories announce themselves with fireworks. Others arrive like rain. Softly. Patiently. Almost unnoticed. Until one day, you realize the landscape has changed completely. Chapter 7. The Houses That Raised Them. Every family has invisible walls. Some are built from love. Some from sacrifice. Some from traditions carried so faithfully that no one remembers who first placed the stones. Children grow up inside those walls believing they are simply the shape of the world. Only later, when they meet someone raised within different walls, do they discover that every home teaches a different map of life. The Mehta home stood in a quiet suburb west of Chicago. Its front porch held potted jasmine and basil. Wind chimes danced gently beneath the eaves. The aroma of cumin, roasted garlic, and fresh coriander greeted Aarav before he even opened the front door. Some scents do more than fill a room. They erase distance. One breath. And childhood returns. His mother looked up from the kitchen. There you are. You've been helping flood victims all day and still managed to miss dinner by 20 minutes. Aarav smiled apologetically. I know. I lost track of time. His father folded his newspaper. That usually means one of two things. You are either solving impossible problems or talking to someone interesting. Aarav laughed. It was a long day. His father raised an eyebrow but let the answer pass. Some fathers know when silence is more revealing than questions. Across the table sat Aarav's grandfather, Harish Mehta. Age had curved his back, but never his spirit. His hands still carried the strength of a man who had built a life from almost nothing. He poured another cup of chai before speaking. When people lose their homes, they don't remember the volunteers who carried the heaviest boxes. They remember the ones who spoke kindly. Aarav nodded. I'll remember that. Harish smiled. I know you will. Across the city, the Khan household was equally alive. The scent of cardamom tea mingled with slow-cooked lamb, saffron rice, and freshly baked naan. Laughter floated from the dining room. Aaliyah's younger brother, Hamza, was animatedly explaining a disastrous attempt to fix his motorcycle. And then the entire exhaust pipe fell off. The room erupted in laughter. Even their father struggled to keep a straight face. You look happy, her mother observed as Aaliyah took her seat. Long day. Very. Worth it. She thought for a moment. Yes. Very worth it. Her mother smiled knowingly. Helping people had always brought that particular light into her daughter's eyes. Her grandmother, Nanny, reached across the table and squeezed Aaliyah's hand. "You've been smiling since you walked in." "I have." "You have." Hamza grinned. "Either someone finally agreed that your cooking is better than Mom's, or you met someone." Aaliyah nearly choked on her tea. "I met hundreds of people today. That's not what I asked." The entire table laughed. She rolled her eyes. "You all watched too many romantic movies." Later that evening, in two different homes, two grandmothers stood at separate kitchen sinks washing teacups beneath warm water. Neither knew the other existed. Yet both whispered almost identical prayers. "May the people we love find someone kind. Not wealthy. Not famous. Not powerful. Simply kind." Outside, night settled across Chicago. Thousands of apartment windows glowed against the darkness. Behind each one lived another family, another story, another dream. Some houses carried laughter. Some carried loneliness. Some carried memories too painful to speak aloud. And somewhere among those countless lights, two families rested peacefully, unaware that the future had already taken its first quiet step toward their front doors. Not with anger, not with conflict, but with kindness. Because love rarely asks permission before it arrives. It simply knocks and waits. Chapter 8. The Stories Grandparents Tell. There is something remarkable about grandparents. They are living libraries. Some shelves remain open. Others stay locked for decades. Not because they wish to hide the truth, but because some memories are so heavy that speaking them aloud feels like lifting the past all over again. History books remember dates. Grandparents remember faces. The Mehta household had grown quiet. Dishes were washed. Lights dimmed. The television murmured softly in another room before falling silent. Only the kitchen remained awake. Harish Mehta sat alone at the table with a cup of cooling chai. Aarav joined him. Neither spoke immediately. They never needed to. Silence had long ago become another language between them. "You met good people today?" Harish finally asked. "I did. The kind that restore your faith in humanity." Harish smiled. "Those are the people worth remembering." Aarav nodded. There was one volunteer. He stopped himself. He hadn't intended to say it aloud. His grandfather noticed. "There usually is." Aarav looked up. "What do you mean?" "The one person your mind keeps returning to after everyone else has gone home." A small smile crept across Aarav's face. "You're very observant." Harish chuckled. "No. I've simply lived long enough." Across the city, Aaliyah sat beside her grandmother on the back porch. The rain had left the air cool and fragrant. Crickets sang from neighboring gardens. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train crossed the city. Nanny wrapped a shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "You've been thinking all evening. Am I that obvious?" "Only to someone who changed your diapers." They both laughed. "Tell me something," Nanny said. "When did you first know you wanted to become a doctor?" Aaliyah frowned. "I thought we were talking about me." "We are." The answer is hidden inside the question. Aaliyah thought carefully. "I suppose I wanted people to feel less afraid." Nanny reached over and squeezed her hand. "Then you chose the right profession." For a while they simply watched the stars emerge above the city. Finally, Aaliyah asked quietly, "Nanny, what was it like leaving home?" The old woman grew still, very still. Some questions travel farther than the person asking them realizes. "It was confusing," she whispered. "One day, The people living across the street were neighbors. The next, they were on the other side of a line someone had drawn on a map. She looked toward the night sky. I lost friends. Not because we stopped caring. Because the world decided we belonged in different places. Aaliyah had heard fragments of this story before. Never the whole thing. Were you angry? Nanny smiled sadly. For a long time. Then one day, I became tired. Tired people eventually choose between carrying bitterness or carrying peace. I chose peace. Back in the Mehta home. Harish reached for an old wooden box tucked inside the kitchen cabinet. He opened it carefully. Inside lay faded photographs. Some were black and white. Some had cracked at the edges. One picture showed a group of smiling young men standing beside a mango tree. Harish pointed toward one face. My best friend. He lived only 3 houses away. What happened to him? Harish closed the box gently. The border happened. Aarav had never heard those words before. Not spoken quite like that. His grandfather stared toward the window. I have spent most of my life wondering whether he ever wondered what became of me. At that very same moment, across Chicago, Nanny was looking at an old photograph of 2 little girls, one Hindu, one Muslim, standing barefoot beside the same river. She smiled through eyes that had known both joy and loss. I hope, she whispered, that somewhere their grandchildren live in a kinder world than we did. Neither grandparent knew that fate had already begun answering that prayer. One quiet conversation, one volunteer shelter, one shared smile at a time. Chapter 9. Morning finds them again. Morning arrives differently after an unforgettable day. The alarm rings at the same hour. The coffee tastes the same. Traffic follows its familiar rhythm. Yet something inside feels altered. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. It is the quiet anticipation of seeing someone again. A feeling that asks no permission before settling into the heart. Chicago awakened beneath a sky washed clean by yesterday's storm. The air carried the crisp scent that follows heavy rain. Sunlight spilled between buildings, turning windows into sheets of gold. The city was already busy. Construction crews returned to work. Buses sighed at every stop. Cyclists threaded through morning traffic. Life, as always, moved forward. Aarav stood in his bedroom, changing shirts for the 3rd time. Blue. No. White. Too formal. Gray. Too ordinary. He sighed. This is ridiculous. From the hallway, his mother called. Everything all right? Fine. You've changed clothes 3 times. He froze. How do you know that? I've been your mother since before you were born. I know things. His father chuckled from the breakfast table. I'll take the gray shirt. You always look trustworthy in gray. Aarav shook his head. I hate that both of you are right. Across the city, Aaliyah found herself standing in front of a mirror longer than usual. Not because she doubted herself. Because she rarely thought about what to wear outside the hospital. Volunteer work wasn't a fashion show. Comfort came first. Still, she untied her ponytail, then tied it again. Twice. Hamza wandered past her bedroom. You going somewhere important? Flood relief. He looked at her for a long moment. You've brushed your hair. I brush my hair every day. Not with that much concentration. She threw a pillow at him. It missed by a spectacular margin. His laughter echoed down the hallway. By 8:30, the shelter was alive once more. New donations had arrived overnight. Volunteers gathered around folding tables, receiving assignments. The energy felt different. Yesterday had been emergency. Today was recovery. The work would be slower, more personal. Families would begin returning to damaged homes. The rebuilding had begun. Aarav stepped through the gymnasium doors. Without thinking, his eyes searched the room. Rows of volunteers. Stacks of supplies. Medical stations. Children drawing with crayons. No blue raincoat. He felt oddly disappointed. Then he laughed at himself. You've been here 12 seconds. At precisely the same moment, Aaliyah entered through the opposite entrance. She scanned the room. Not consciously. At least, that is what she would later tell herself. Her gaze moved past tables. Past volunteers. Past registration. No sign of him. Morning, Dr. Khan. She smiled politely. Morning. Yet some small part of her attention remained elsewhere. The volunteer coordinator clapped his hands. All right, everyone. We've got enough people today to split into neighborhood teams. Names were called. Groups assigned. Addresses distributed. Aaliyah Khan. She stepped forward. North Ridge team. Aarav Mehta. He looked up. North Ridge team. For the briefest instant, neither reacted. Then their eyes met across the room. There it was. That familiar smile. Not large. Not dramatic. Just enough to say, I'm glad you're here. As the volunteers filed toward the waiting vans, the little girl with the patched dinosaur spotted them from across the gym. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mom. They found each other again. Her mother looked up. She smiled without understanding the deeper meaning behind her daughter's words. Children rarely explain destiny. They simply recognize it when they see it. Outside. The vans rolled away beneath a brilliant summer sky, toward flooded streets, broken homes. And the next chapter of a story neither Aarav nor Aaliyah yet realized they were writing together. Far behind them, the shadows of history remained patient, waiting. Not to stop them, but to test whether love could become stronger than the stories people inherit. Chapter 10. An Empty House. There is a silence unlike any other. It does not belong to forests, or churches, or libraries. It belongs to a home that has been suddenly emptied by water, where photographs once rested. Only damp outlines remain. Where laughter once echoed. Only dripping ceilings answer. Disaster has a strange way of making absence visible. The North Ridge neighborhood had escaped the worst of the flooding. But escaped was a generous word. Mud-coated driveways. Furniture sat piled along sidewalks. Children's bicycles leaned against trees, rust already beginning to bloom across their chains. Family photographs dried on blankets stretched across front lawns. Every home carried a different wound. No two losses looked alike. Aarav and Aaliyah were assigned to a modest brick house at the end of Maple Avenue. An elderly widow named Margaret Ellis stood on the porch clutching a ring of house keys. She smiled when she saw the volunteers, but it was the smile of someone trying to remain brave for strangers. Thank you for coming. Her voice trembled despite her best effort. I wasn't sure where to begin. You don't have to begin alone, Aaliyah said gently. We'll figure it out together. Those simple words loosened something inside Margaret. She nodded quickly, blinking away tears. The front door groaned open. The smell met them first. Wet drywall. Warped wood. Mold beginning its quiet work. Every room bore the watermark of the flood. Nearly 3 feet high. a brown line circling the walls like a memory the house could not erase. Aarav walked slowly through the living room. A family portrait lay face down beneath a collapsed bookshelf. He picked it up carefully. The frame had cracked. The glass had shattered. But the photograph inside had survived. A young couple. 2 little boys. A golden retriever. Margaret noticed. My husband. She pointed to the man. He passed away 4 years ago. Her finger rested on the picture just a little longer. I thought I'd lost that. Aarav handed it back with both hands, as though returning something sacred. You haven't. Meanwhile, Aaliyah moved through the kitchen, checking for hazards. She opened cabinets swollen shut by water, sorted medications, made notes for the insurance volunteers arriving later that afternoon. Then she noticed something sitting alone on the windowsill. A tiny ceramic bird. Everything around it had been ruined. Yet somehow, the little bird remained untouched. She smiled. Looks like someone refused to leave. Margaret laughed through fresh tears. My granddaughter painted that when she was 8. I've moved it 3 different times. It always finds its way back to that window. By noon, the 4 of them had filled nearly 20 contractor bags. Broken carpet. Ruined drywall. Waterlogged books. Furniture too damaged to save. Each trip to the curb felt like saying goodbye to another chapter of someone's life. During a short break, Margaret disappeared into the kitchen. When she returned, she carried a weathered tin box. I can't pay you, but I can feed you. Inside were homemade oatmeal cookies, slightly crushed. Still delicious. My husband used to say, no one should rebuild a house on an empty stomach. Aarav accepted one. So did my grandfather. Aaliyah looked at him. My grandmother says exactly the same thing. Margaret smiled. Maybe grandparents all attend the same secret meetings. The 3 of them laughed. The sound drifted out the broken front door and into the warm summer afternoon. For the first time since the flood, that little house sounded like a home again. As the day drew on, Margaret watched the 2 young volunteers work together. Not hurried. Not showy. Simply kind. There was an ease between them that reminded her of another time. Another generation. Another beginning. She tucked the thought away without saying it aloud. Some observations are better left to bloom quietly. Because sometimes, the strongest foundations are not poured with concrete. They are built one shared burden. One rescued photograph. One small act of compassion. At a time. Chapter 11. The Prayer Room. Every home has a heartbeat. Sometimes it is the kitchen. Sometimes the front porch. Sometimes an old armchair where someone always sits. And sometimes it is the smallest room in the house. The room where hope is whispered instead of spoken. Margaret paused outside a narrow hallway. There is one room I haven't been able to open. Her voice carried an unfamiliar hesitation. The water swelled the door shut. Aarav examined the frame. The wood had expanded. The hinges grown beneath years of humidity and 2 days of floodwater. It may take a little patience. Margaret smiled sadly. I've waited 2 days. I can wait a little longer. Together, Aarav eased a pry bar into the frame. Not forcing it. Listening to the wood. Respecting its age. The door protested with a long creak before finally yielding. A rush of cool, damp air drifted into the hallway. Inside, the room was surprisingly untouched. It was no larger than a walk-in closet. A single chair rested against the wall. A small wooden shelf held an open Bible. Beside it sat a worn leather prayer journal, a brass cross, and a candle that had long since burned down to its final inch. Sunlight filtered through a tiny stained glass window, scattering soft colors across the floor. Water had reached the doorway, but not beyond it. It was as though the flood had stopped, one step short. Margaret covered her mouth. My husband built this room. He said every house should have one place where fear isn't allowed. Her voice broke. We prayed here every morning. Aaliyah stood quietly beside her. No speeches. No rehearsed comfort. She simply rested a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. Sometimes presence speaks more clearly than words. Aarav carefully lifted the prayer journal. The pages were dry. He handed it back with the same reverence he had shown the family photograph. Margaret held it close. I thought I'd lost this too. No, Aarav said softly. It was waiting for you. The three stood in silence, each offering gratitude in a different way. Margaret bowed her head. Aaliyah whispered a quiet prayer beneath her breath. Aarav closed his eyes for a brief moment, remembering the small prayer corner in his grandparents' home where incense drifted each morning before sunrise. Different traditions. Different words. The same human longing. Hope. Protection. Peace. As they stepped back into the hallway, Margaret looked thoughtfully at the two young volunteers. You know, my husband used to tell me something. What was that? Aaliyah asked. He said, God has more languages than people do. She smiled. I think he was right. Neither Aarav nor Aaliyah replied. They simply smiled. Because some truths don't belong to one religion. They belong to humanity itself. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the last of the lingering clouds. Children rode bicycles again. Neighbors borrowed tools from one another. Someone grilled hamburgers on a driveway for every family working on repairs. The neighborhood, though scarred, had begun healing. Not because every wall had been rebuilt, but because no one was rebuilding alone. As they loaded the final bags into the truck, Aaliyah glanced at Aarav. You know, you were right yesterday. He looked puzzled. About what? Deep dish pizza. He raised an eyebrow. It really is just a casserole pretending to be pizza. He laughed. I never thought I'd hear you admit that. Don't get used to winning. I won't. But I'll enjoy this one. Their laughter rose above the sound of hammers, saws, and children's voices. It was light, easy, uncomplicated. Neither noticed the elderly man across the street watching from his porch. He smiled to himself. They laugh like people who haven't yet learned how difficult the road ahead will be. Then he paused. Perhaps they're exactly the people who can walk it. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets of North Ridge, the past stirred once more. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in memory. Because memories, like rivers, have a way of finding the next bend. Chapter 12. The Call Home. There comes a moment in every growing friendship when the world outside finally notices. Not because anything extraordinary has happened, but because patterns begin to change. A smile arrives too easily. A phone remains just a little closer. An ordinary name begins appearing in ordinary conversations. And families. Families notice before anyone else. The volunteers finished just after sunset. North Ridge looked different than it had that morning. The flood scars remained. But so did fresh drywall stacked neatly beside homes. Neighbors waved to one another from ladders. Children chased each other across lawns that only yesterday had been buried beneath muddy water. Hope, like construction, was noisy. It echoed from every hammer strike, every shared meal, every helping hand. As the volunteers packed away their tools, Aaliyah's phone buzzed. Mom calling. She smiled apologetically. I should probably take this. Aarav nodded. I'll finish loading the truck. She stepped a short distance away. Hi, Mom. Have you eaten? Aaliyah laughed softly. Hello to you too. You skipped breakfast. I know. And lunch. Mostly. Her mother sighed. I raised a doctor who forgets she has a body. I'll eat. You promise. I promise. A brief pause. Then came the question every parent eventually asks. Who are you working with? Aaliyah glanced across the parking lot. Aarav was helping an elderly volunteer fold tables. He laughed at something she couldn't hear. Without realizing it, she smiled. Just another volunteer. Just another volunteer? Her mother had heard that tone before. Years ago. During college. When a classmate had slowly become a close friend. I see. What? Nothing. I heard that nothing. Her mother chuckled. We'll talk tonight. The call ended. Aaliyah stared at the silent phone. I said almost nothing. She whispered. So why do mothers always hear everything? Across the lot, Aarav's phone vibrated. Dadaji. He answered immediately. Hi, Dadaji. Finished saving the world? Not yet. Good. It still needs work. Harish chuckled warmly. You sound lighter today. I do. You do. There was a pause. Then came the gentle question. Did you make a new friend? Aarav looked toward Aaliyah without thinking. She was laughing quietly to herself while slipping her phone back into her pocket. I think. I did. His grandfather smiled, though Aarav couldn't see it. Good. The older you become, the harder it is to meet truly good people. When you find one, don't rush. But don't disappear either. As both conversations ended, neither Aarav nor Aaliyah realized something important. Their families had not asked about names, or religion, or nationality. Not yet. They had simply noticed happiness. The harder questions still slept quietly beyond the horizon. The volunteer coordinator approached. Great work today. We'll need people again this weekend. I'll be here, Aarav answered. So will I, Aaliyah added. Their responses came almost simultaneously. They looked at one another. Smiled. Neither pretended it was accidental. As they walked toward their cars, the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and damp earth. The city glowed amber beneath the setting sun. Traffic hummed in the distance like a heartbeat. Aarav opened his car door, then hesitated. So, there's a coffee shop halfway between here and downtown. I've heard it serves something other than casserole disguised as pizza. Aaliyah laughed. I suppose that's progress. Would you? She already knew the question before he finished. Like to get coffee? There it was. Not a declaration. Not a grand romantic gesture. Just two simple words that have quietly changed millions of lives. Get coffee. She looked at him for a moment. Long enough to imagine saying no. Long enough to realize she didn't want to. I'd like that. Neither knew that this ordinary invitation would become the first page of a story their grandchildren might one day tell. Because love rarely begins with fireworks. Sometimes, it begins with a cup of coffee and the courage to ask. Beneath the Same Sky. Season 1, Episode 1. The First Hello. Chapter 13, Coffee Between Worlds. There are invitations that change nothing. See you tomorrow. Take care. Drive safely. Then there are invitations that quietly shift the course of two lives. Not because they are extravagant, but because they ask a simple question. Would you like to know me beyond this moment? Coffee has launched revolutions, ended friendships, started businesses, healed broken hearts. And on one warm Chicago evening, It became the bridge between two strangers who were no longer strangers at all. The cafe sat on a quiet corner where an old brick warehouse had been transformed into a neighborhood gathering place. Large windows spilled amber light onto the sidewalk. Books lined one wall. Local artists had filled another with paintings of Chicago through the seasons. The smell of freshly ground coffee mingled with cinnamon, vanilla, and warm bread. It was the sort of place where conversations naturally slowed down. Neither Aarav nor Aaliyah had been there before. Somehow, it already felt familiar. "You choose," Aarav said as they reached the counter. "That's dangerous." "Why?" "I judge coffee very seriously." "I was hoping you would." She laughed. "In that case." She ordered a cardamom latte. He paused. "Cardamom. It reminds me of home." He smiled. "My grandmother puts cardamom in almost everything." "Mine too." They looked at each other, then laughed. They found a small table beside the window. Outside, evening drifted across the city. People hurried home from work. Cyclists passed beneath glowing streetlights. A saxophone player performed on the corner, his music floating through the open cafe door like a gentle breeze. For the first few minutes, they spoke about ordinary things. Favorite authors. The worst jobs they had ever worked. Whether Chicago winters should be considered a natural disaster. Then, the conversation deepened. "What made you become an engineer?" Aaliyah asked. Aarav stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "When I was 12, my grandfather handed me an old radio. It didn't work. He told me, if you can understand how broken things work, one day you'll understand how to build better ones. So I took it apart." "Did you fix it?" "No." She laughed. "It exploded." She nearly spilled her coffee. "It exploded?" "Spectacularly." My grandfather looked at the smoke and congratulated me. "Why?" He said failure meant I'd finally started learning. "What about you?" he asked. "Medicine wasn't exactly my childhood dream." "It wasn't." She shook her head. "I wanted to be an artist." "You?" "I painted everything. Walls. Books. One unfortunate dining table." He laughed. "What changed?" Her smile softened. "When I was 15, my grandmother became very ill. I spent weeks sitting beside her hospital bed. There was one doctor who never rushed. He always looked people in the eye. He remembered everyone's names. When she recovered, I realized I didn't want people to remember my prescriptions. I wanted them to remember how I made them feel." Silence settled between them. Not empty. Reflective. The kind of silence reserved for truths that deserve room to breathe. The waitress returned with a slice of warm apple pie. "We didn't order this." She smiled. "The elderly couple over there did." She nodded toward the opposite corner. An older husband and wife raised their teacups with cheerful smiles. "It's your first date, isn't it?" Both Aarav and Aaliyah answered at exactly the same time. "No." Then they looked at each other and laughed. The elderly woman winked. "That's exactly what we said." Her husband chuckled. 47 years ago. The cafe joined their laughter. Even strangers smiled. Some moments carry a warmth that quietly spreads through a room. As the evening continued, neither Aarav nor Aaliyah noticed the time. Hours slipped away unnoticed. They discovered a shared love of old bookstores, classical music, street food, volunteer work, late-night conversations, family recipes, and grandparents who believed food could solve almost every problem. Yet, there remained one subject they had both unconsciously circled around. Faith. Neither had asked. Not because they feared the answer, but because tonight, the person mattered more than the label. Outside, The lights of Chicago shimmered across the river. Inside, two lives continued drawing closer, neither realizing that somewhere, just beyond the warmth of the cafe windows, the first real test of their story had already begun walking toward them. Chapter 14. The Man at the Next Table. Every story has a turning point. Rarely does it announce itself. It does not arrive with thunder or dramatic music. It arrives quietly, disguised as coincidence, as chance, as one stranger happening to overhear another. The world often calls these moments accidents. History prefers a different word. The cafe had grown busier as the evening deepened. Students filled long tables with laptops and textbooks. A young couple debated travel plans over shared cheesecake. An elderly man carefully worked through a crossword puzzle with a pencil worn almost to the eraser. Near the back of the cafe, a businessman closed his laptop, paid his bill, and walked toward the door. As he passed Aarav and Aaliyah's table, he heard just enough. "My grandmother came from Lahore." The man slowed almost imperceptibly. Then he heard another sentence. "My grandfather grew up in Gujarat." His eyes lingered on the two young strangers. Not with anger. Not even with disapproval. With recognition. The kind that comes from carrying a story of your own. He continued walking without saying a word. Yet the name stayed with him. Back at the table, neither Aarav nor Aaliyah noticed. They were discussing childhood memories. "My father taught me to ride a bicycle," Aarav said. "He ran beside me for half the street." "What happened?" "He let go." "You crashed?" "Into Mrs. Henderson's rose bushes." Aaliyah laughed so hard she covered her face. "Please tell me there are pictures." "My mother has preserved the evidence. For blackmail purposes." "Naturally." "And you?" She smiled. "My brother convinced me I could fly." "Oh no." "I climbed onto the garage roof." "I don't like where this story is going." "I jumped." "You jumped." "I was 8. You survived." "Barely." "My grandmother said, Allah gave you a wonderful brain. Perhaps next time you should bring it with you." Aarav laughed until tears formed in his eyes. "I think our grandmothers would become best friends. I think they'd argue for an hour, then cook together for the rest of the day." Outside, the businessman paused beneath a streetlight before getting into his car. He stared back at the cafe. His expression had changed. He reached into his wallet and removed an old photograph. Two young men, one Hindu, one Muslim, standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling without reservation. The picture had faded. The friendship never had. He whispered quietly, "I hope you two have an easier road than we did." Then he slipped the photograph back into his wallet and drove away. Inside, the waitress returned to refill their cups. "You've been here almost 3 hours. Have we?" She nodded. "Happens all the time. When people stop checking the clock, it usually means they're enjoying each other." She smiled knowingly before returning to the counter. Aaliyah looked out the window. "I should probably head home." "You probably should." Neither moved. "Again." She laughed. "We're getting very bad at saying goodbye." "We seem to be. Is that a problem?" He considered the question. "No, I don't think it is." As they stood to leave, Aarav reached for the door at the exact moment Aaliyah did. Their hands brushed. Only for an instant. Neither pulled away abruptly. Neither pretended it hadn't happened. Instead, they smiled. A simple moment. Small enough that anyone watching might have forgotten it by morning. Yet both of them would remember it long after this evening had ended. Because affection rarely arrives all at once. It gathers, like rain filling a quiet river. One drop, one conversation, one shared laugh, one accidental touch. Until one day, You realize you've crossed into waters too deep to ignore. Across the city, two grandparents looked out separate windows before going to bed. Each whispered a prayer for a future they could not yet see. Neither knew that those prayers were already walking hand in hand beneath the lights of Chicago. End of chapter 14. Beneath the Same Sky. Season 1, Episode 1. The First Hello. Chapter 15. Questions Without Answers. Every love story begins twice. The first beginning belongs to the heart. The second belongs to the mind. The heart asks only one question. How do I feel when I'm with this person? The mind asks many more. Who are they? Where do they come from? Will my family understand? Can two lives truly become one? Most people believe these questions appear only after love. They are mistaken. Sometimes they arrive before love has even found the courage to speak its own name. The drive home was quieter than either of them expected. Not because there was nothing to think about. Because there was too much. Chicago's skyline shimmered in the rearview mirrors of two separate cars heading toward opposite ends of the city. Traffic moved steadily. Streetlights painted golden ribbons across rain-darkened roads. The radio played. Neither of them heard a single song. Aarav replayed the evening. The laughter. The stories. The cardamom latte. The way Aaliyah listened without interrupting. The way she spoke about medicine. The way her eyes brightened whenever she mentioned her grandmother. He smiled, then caught himself. What exactly are you smiling about? The question came from nowhere. Or perhaps, from somewhere much deeper. Across town. Aaliyah rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel. The other tapped absent-mindedly against the cup holder. She remembered the old couple in the cafe. That's exactly what we said. 47 years ago. She laughed softly to herself. Definitely not a date. The words sounded strangely unconvincing inside the quiet car. When Aarav arrived home, the house was still awake. His father sat reading in the living room. His mother folded laundry while an old Hindi song played quietly in the background. His grandfather looked up from his book. Coffee? Aarav blinked. How did you know? Harish smiled. You smell like roasted coffee beans. And he tilted his head. You're smiling again. His mother looked over the top of a neatly folded towel. So, was this volunteer work? Or volunteer work followed by coffee? Aarav froze. His father burst into laughter. I told you she'd figure it out. You two have been discussing me? His father shrugged. We've been married 34 years. We discuss everything. Across the city. Aaliyah quietly slipped through the front door. She had almost reached the staircase when her mother's voice floated from the kitchen. Did the coffee taste good? Aaliyah stopped walking. Very slowly. She turned. You knew. I know my daughter. You've never been late after volunteering. And tonight. You weren't tired. You were glowing. Hamza leaned around the refrigerator door with a grin. I told you. Told who? Everyone. She pointed at him dramatically. You are no longer my favorite sibling. I'm your only sibling. Exactly. Later that night, two bedrooms remained illuminated long after the rest of each house had gone dark. Aarav sat beside his window, phone in hand. He stared at one name. Aaliyah. Should he send a message? Too soon? Too late? Too ordinary? He typed. I'm glad we got coffee. He deleted it. Typed again. Drive home safely? Deleted. Finally, he laughed at himself. Across Chicago. Aaliyah was doing exactly the same thing. She typed. Thank you for tonight. Deleted. I had fun. Deleted. Good night. Deleted. She sighed. This is ridiculous. At precisely 10:17 p.m., Both phones lit up at exactly the same moment. Aarav, I made it home safely. Thanks for the coffee. Aaliyah, I made it home too. Thank you. I really enjoyed tonight. For a heartbeat. Silence. Then both laughed. Miles apart. For exactly the same reason. Aarav replied. Looks like we had the same idea. Three dots appeared almost instantly. I was just thinking the same thing. Another pause. Then. Sleep well, Aarav. You too, Aaliyah. No dramatic confession. No promises. No declarations. Just two people ending an ordinary evening. Yet somewhere beyond their windows, the city kept turning, unaware that something extraordinary had quietly begun. Because every enduring love story is built long before anyone says, I love you. It is built in kindness, in patience, in listening, in shared laughter, and sometimes, in two messages sent at exactly the same moment, neither realizing that tomorrow, the questions would begin. The real questions.